أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه وخاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيد الأولين والآخرين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين اللهم صل على ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. Inshallah, we are continuing on the same topic that we started yesterday, where we are looking at Karbala as a model or as a paradigm by which we can learn certain themes from its deeper messages. And we've tackled justice so far, and we've started the issue of faith. And yesterday, if you remember, I posed the question that if Karbala is to be relevant, not just at the time, if you like, of Muharram, but in our day-to-day life, it has to pose us certain questions which build our identity. Will we make the right decisions when our faith is tested? And in fact, how do we cultivate our faith? How do we develop it? We found in the situation of Hur that he was in a way between heaven and hell, that he was faced with a momentous decision that would affect his own conscience and his identity. And of course, he chose the side of al-Husayn alayhi salam. But the kind of faith that he developed was arguably based on the first principle of faith by Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala. And Imam Ali said that one of the first principles of faith is yaqeen, certainty. But certainty is achieved through questioning. Questioning in order to seek truth, to attain an inner conviction. And that's exactly what Hur did. So when we look at this process of building faith, it comes after a number of questions where we seek to understand ourselves, where we seek to understand our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the less that we question, the less that we ignore what we want, the less that we ignore our nafs, the less that we alleviate our doubts, the more that our faith becomes very shaky. The more that we actually don't find we are constructing something genuine with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a reason that I say that, because As-Sadiq alayhi salam has a hadith in Al-Kafi, or it is reported in Al-Kafi, where he says that one who has no sabr has no faith. Meaning that one who loses those mental faculties and one who does not have a calmness of judgment and a calmness of acting has no faith, does not know how to tackle a situation. It means at any instant, our faith becomes non-existent, or we lose our sense of faith because we're not able to understand what is it that we are meant to do in a particular situation. Whether that is in the case of Hur, when we are challenged and we have to choose a particular moral action, or in our day-to-day dealings, in our business, in our professions, in our relationships. Thus, faith becomes or can become like a pendulum, which is exactly what we don't want. Because then we cannot measure our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why Imam Ali's hadith becomes very important, which I want to continue on today, where he mentions three other components. He mentions zuhud, abstaining from kind of worldly temptations, and he mentions jihad, striving in the way of righteousness, and justice, but justice in terms of our judgment and our decision making and our dealings. How is this hadith, or how are these components relevant to Karbala and specifically relevant to us? In this lecture, I want to investigate these questions more deeply. What is it that influences our decision making in life? When we call ourselves Shia Muslims, or we say we want to build faith, what is it that actually affects our decision making? What makes you and I different if I, for example, choose to gain knowledge, or choose to reflect, or I choose to approach a relationship in a certain way? What is the barometer? What are the principles that we use in order to make these decisions about how faithful we are to God. Because we said that faith is trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because God gives us a sense of security and safety. Now, we are making a huge presumption in our lives, and I don't know whether we take time to examine this presumption. We are assuming that we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already. We are assuming that we know how Allah gives us safety. This is a huge presumption. Now, of course, I'm born a Shia Muslim, and alhamdulillah, I'm very proud that I want to follow Imam alayhi Islam, and this is all wonderful. But as I said yesterday, that there are certain expectations leveled upon us, that we are automatically meant to understand Imam Ali's conception of God. We're automatically meant to understand and appreciate the sacrifice of Karbala or the sacrifice of Imam Husayn. Is that really the case? Sometimes when you meet people that come to faith and they come through questioning, I said converts, reverts, whatever you want to say, they come through a process where they are exercising their mental and spiritual faculties to accept a concept. Now, if you're already, of course, born in the faith, you're expected to accept the concepts, and that's fine. I mean, it's good to have a religious environment. But then there comes another challenge with that. How do we find these notions that we are growing up with meaningful in our day-to-day life? And I think that's a tougher question. That was the question that faced the Kufans, of course, because as was narrated in the conversations yesterday, whoever played Imam Husayn, because you change your characters, so I get confused. It's just a joke. So I don't know, what's your brother's name? You should play Ibn Ziyad all the time. So that's a compliment because of your acting, not because of your character, inshallah. Salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So whoever played Imam Husayn alayhi salam, he was of course contemplating as to what he should do on his journey, of how he should respect the decision making of the Kufan or the communications that the Kufan people were giving him. And the advisors were saying, be cautious of the Kufan people. Be cautious. And you could see from that within the Kufans there was this terrible problem or terrible conflict which they had, which is, okay, we find that Imam Husayn is a good man, but do we have enough faith? Do we have enough trust in God that God will give our life safety and our possession safety and will look after us by choosing Husayn? Do you see that? Because we defined faith like that yesterday. So that was the inner conflict which they had. Because at the end of the day, they were caught just as Hur was caught between heaven and hell. And the decision they made was a decision which did not necessarily increase their iman towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Either it regressed, either it was in no man's land, and of course Allah will judge, everybody will judge us, or either they did not have a conception of morality. I mean, we don't know what went through their minds really. But it just shows us that today when we see injustices, when we see wars, I mentioned the problem of Bahrain in lecture 2, even when we see a beggar in London, for example, what is our duty? Because we often say, is the beggar meaningful? Does he have a genuine identity? Should I give something? Should I not? We are faced with a moral conflict perhaps every day, or a moral conflict in our workplace. And one of the things I often question myself is, I might be studying, for example, so I'm accomplishing maybe the component of yaqeen according to the first Imam, because the first Imam says, always try to question, to seek the truth and attain conviction. But what happens if I'm not making the right moral decision? What happens if I don't give to the beggar on Edgware Road, for example? Does that mean I'm losing a part of my faith? That means either we look at faith as a complete package with certain components that we have to fulfill. Then we know that we are increasing it. Then we know that, okay, I'm overcoming my worldly temptation, I'm making the right moral decision, I am now seeking knowledge, I'm not just following blindly. Then I can say, yes, today I have increased my faith. If I miss one or two or three components out, then what can I say about myself? Am I increasing my faith? It's important, I think, to have some kind of measurement as to what is happening in our lives every day. And as I have said, Karbala provides a paradigm for this, because we see at every step of the way people measuring their own trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People like Wahab, Haniya and Qamar, Christians, Wahab and Hania, young married couple who joined the movement of al-Husayn because they reflected on the message. And they decided, no, I think this is the best moral course of action, and this is better than our personal happiness as a married couple. What a hard and difficult decision to make. And you can see how that lesson is eternally relevant to young married couples, to relationships, to just simply young people. What kind of life do we want to lead? What vision should young people have when they embark on a relationship or a young person going to university? I said, I think, 3 lectures ago that the educational system in this country, I'm going to mention this in the last 3 lectures, that universities are very much business orientated. That essentially professors and scholars are disconnected to grassroots and classrooms. This applies to both university and Hausa as well. That second, we don't have enough sciences. Again, both within the Western and Muslim sphere, because I mentioned 2 quotes, if you remember, Ali Shariati and Professor Kostas Douzinas, who's at Birkbeck University, they both said practically the same thing. They said we do not have a science or people focusing on subjects which are elevating societies from injustice to justice. And Ali Shariati said that he'd rather have one Abu Dhar instead of Ibn Sina and Ghazali. What a bold statement to make. Extremely bold statement. But in a way he's right. Because what's the point of discussing all this when just down the road or in your society, in your neighborhood, there's absolute corruption and facade? What is the point of talking about this? It means, therefore, that faith, or at least the model of Karbala and the incidents in Karbala, have to have some bold impact in our lives. Otherwise, we perhaps are paying lip service to Karbala. Salawat. So Imam Ali alayhi salam continues in his hadith by saying that the other 3 components of faith, which we're going to examine, are zuhud, jihad, and adl. Zuhud, essentially, which a lot of urafa, a lot of mystics emphasize when they are trying to spiritually develop themselves, is the power of the nafs to overcome its desires and temptations, essentially. Any type of desires and temptations, talking too much, eating too much, base sexual desires, for example, greediness, whatever it is. Because those things descend or put the nafs into animality. And akhlaq as a discipline is actually to teach a person to move from animality, if you like, from animality to humanness, to angelicness and beyond. Because arguably we have the capacity to become even greater than angels. So akhlaq is there to teach us to leave those animalistic kind of desires, because then we become very ungodly. And arguably in Barzakh or in Akhirah, one of the kind of punishments, or maybe it is the punishment, I don't know, we don't know the nature of Akhirah and Barzakh fully, but arguably one of the biggest punishments is the fact that we have to leave those worldly attachments and temptations which we are so used to, but which the nafs now cannot act because it doesn't have a body. So now the nafs has to get used to a celestial and spiritual kind of abode, which should be in tune with Allah's existence, with Allah's light. So you can imagine that one of the biggest components of faith is to leave those temptations and prepare our soul to return to the Almighty. The second one, jihad, is essentially what we are discussing, or what is related to Karbala, which is striving towards moral righteousness and struggling through circumstances and bearing tragedies. Again, this is the hardest thing, because if illness befalls us or one of our family members, we see death, for example, we see suffering, we become irritable. Those kind of things challenge us, because at that point, we require our nafs to be very stable, and we must act with our intellect, with our aql. By not acting like that, as I said from the hadith of the 6th Imam, we lose our faith. Because faith expects us to act in a way that God likes, to act in a way that reflects His attributes, not my very limited attributes. So at one point, I should be merciful, and I should be patient, and I should demonstrate knowledge. I should not demonstrate my limitations or the fact that I have not struggled and I've succumbed to these circumstances. That is not the mark of a courageous or a godly or a noble man or woman. We see from Karbala. Who do we see? Habib ibn Madahir. After Muslim ibn Aqil, it was al-Husayn who relied on Habib. That showed this sense, no, I am going to remain steadfast. Despite my age, despite my background, whatever it is, I am going to support al-Husayn. This is an example of jihad, and that obviously runs throughout Karbala. The last one, adl, of course you may think it's kind of fair dealings, but in the hadith, Imam Ali means a fairness of mind, a kind of clear and free decision-making process happening, where whenever I am embarking on a dealing with another human being, whenever I'm making a decision in life, it is done fairly. It is done with my mind paying attention to some detail. That is justice. It's a kind of, if you remember, we defined adl as equilibrium and balance. Qist meant justice and fair dealings and due proportion. But adl means that we have internal balance as well. Whenever I am embarking on any decision in life, I must embark on it by looking at all the details, by making a decision which is very rational, which is very patient. And then I have attended to that problem justly. If I hurry the lecture, if I don't research, if I hurry my relationship, if I hurry whatever I want, I'm not being just to that situation. That's what Imam Ali means. I'm not attending to the situation with equilibrium and balance. Now let us think about these four components. What does it tell us? Every aspect of our life is affected by all of these four components. And that in turn builds or perhaps destroys or weakens our faith. And therefore, next time we want to reflect on ourselves, am I a faithful person? We should measure whether we are accomplishing or moving forward in our journey to Allah with these four components. And when if we are able to do that, then perhaps we are now using Karbala as a very active paradigm and model in our lives. Salawat. Now, that is perhaps a practical four components I've given you, but we still have to apply it in our day-to-day situations, which again is a difficult thing. The question I'm posing here, which again, to bring the Kufans back in, what influences affect us in our moral and spiritual decision-making process? Is it the fact that we have the Prophet as a very charismatic figure, or Imam Hussein as a charismatic figure? So this is one of the inspirations that we have about our faith. Maybe we have the Quran, so we're very lucky. And therefore, I've given you these four components, so I shouldn't say any more to you. You have to go and apply it, and I should go and apply it. Is that now the easiest thing that we can do? Because you can say we have everything laid out in front of us. Maybe it's the custom of our family, the custom of this center, the fact that we have a madrasa or the way we eat together. So already, we should already know what type of influences, positive or even negative, affect us. I want to go into this because there are four sources which affect our decision making when it comes to how faithful we want to be. One is our fitrah, how we regard our inclination to God and righteousness. Number two is how we regard God and revelation. Number three is how we value our figures, our charismatic figures. And the reason I'm using these terms, because whether you want to say Western or Islamic ethics doesn't really matter. Because it's the same in each case. If you look in Western ethics, Aristotle or Kant would be leading figures for morality, and people would look back at them and say, this is how we should behave. We would look back at our dear Prophet or Imam Ali or Imam Hussein, for example. Again, what is our relationship with this great charismatic figure, and how do we apply him in our life? And the other one is our custom. What about the custom of our forefathers, the customs of the community centers? In fact, in the first lecture, as you know, I was very clear that these lectures are there to provide perhaps new customs or new lenses in the way that we look at Karbala, that apart from the foundation of commemoration and Azadari, which is a great institution, we should now also look at other lenses by which we can form new customs in order to understand Karbala. And all of this affects us, because depending on our environment, we will act a certain way. And therefore, however you are brought up, or I am brought up, that affects our faith. Bringing up children in a particular way, teaching in a particular way, behaving in a particular way. If we are aware of these influences, then we are better able to navigate ourselves and say, actually, I'm going to accept this or I'm going to reject this. I'm going to build my faith in a particular way, and I'm now going to act in a way that's going to be righteous, regardless of what other people think, or I'm going to follow the people in this matter because it makes sense to me. Having that self-awareness is crucial, because then we can say we are in touch with our identity, definitely. Then we can say, I know myself and therefore I know my Lord. Then we can say that. And how many of us can say we have that claim over ourselves? We have that control. We have that direction in our life, that we are breaking always new grounds. Maybe in our moral life, maybe I can give to that beggar on Edgware Road, or I can construct a new discipline for myself, or, as I said, a new lens for Karbala. Do we consider ourselves as creative, as in control human beings that can forge our iman? This is the question which I feel Karbala poses us. Salawat. I want to actually begin examining this through a hadith of a first Imam, and this hadith is in Mustadrik al-Wasail wa Mustanbat al-Masail by Mirza Hussain al-Nuri. And it's a very beautiful hadith actually. It's in volume 11, page 193. Imam Ali says, if there was no desire for paradise, nor fear of hell, and also no reward or punishment in the next world, even then it would have been befitting to strive for moral perfection, because good morals are the path towards prosperity and victory. Such a beautiful hadith, which is also quoted by later scholars such as Ayatollah Amini as well, in his book Self-Building. It's quite accessible book on alislam.org. And the hadith tells us that akhlaq in itself is so attractive. It's perhaps natural in us that we should be aware or we can discover morals, but behaving morally is a good thing for society. A society built on trust and promises is a society that moves forward. But a society that is always scared of each other and doesn't know who to trust cannot move forward. And therefore morals simply make sense. Apart from thawab, apart from maybe it feels good, morals, simply put, make sense. Therefore, when we are to be faithful and say, Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I want to be the best servant to you, it is because God's ideals and attributes make sense to us. Because acting mercifully and acting in a forgiving way and acting through knowledge simply is a rational and intelligent thing to do. Therefore, next time we may act immorally or we act in an unfaithful manner, we're acting unintelligently. We're acting in a way that does not bring any success to our lives, actually. So now when we think, what are our influences when we make decisions, we must also think that faith is actually a matter of our intellect. It's a matter of intelligent decision making. And when I say intellect or aql, which I'll come on to, I do not mean this sort of cold, rational thinking. I also mean reflection and meditation and seeking guidance from Allah, as well as, of course, reading books and analysis and all these things. This together allows faith to be a very intelligent thing. And then it's up to us where we go. For Imam Ali says in Nahju Balagha, this is saying number 237, he says, there are people who worship Allah to gain His favors. This is the worship of traders. I'm sure you've heard this hadith. While there are some who worship Him to keep themselves free from His anger. And this is the worship of slaves. And there are a few, perhaps very few, who obey Him out of their sense of gratitude and obligations. This is the worship of free and noble men. Faithful people are free people. Ultimately free. We are free to act. We are free to act in a way that gives us a meaningful identity in front of God. That's a faithful person. And you notice that it is out of humility and thanks. A faithful person is one that's humble, one that says, Shukran lillah. These kind of people, let me give an example here. It is reported that when As-Sadiq alayhi salam used to drink, this is in Al-Kafi, when As-Sadiq used to drink water, he used to pick up the cup, and at every sip he used to say, Shukran lillah. He used to sip, take it away, say Alhamdulillah, or give a gratitude, and then drink again. This was the specific moral conduct of the Imams. A faithful person therefore recognizes that everything is a blessing of God, and that every blessing requires our appreciation. That's the mark of a faithful person. But at the same time, a faithful person is a free person. He's not fearful. He's not fearful of what society thinks. He's not fearful of doing something under pressure. He's making his mark in his own life. And he's building a very godly life for himself or herself. And he's trying to elevate society from one level to the next. That, in my view, defines al-Husayn alayhi salam. If you analyze most of his sermons in Karbala, he is always saying that this shamefulness is not befitting for me. Shamefulness, ignominy it's not befitting for me. It's not befitting for a faithful person. I can't act like that. He's taking control of his life. And as I said, who knows what we can do with our lives? Who knows what we can do with Karbala? Some of you mentioned, I think, in the first lecture, the Who is Hussein campaign, which is a very wonderful start. And I gave some examples in the first, second, and third lecture, how we could use Karbala in Britain, actually. How the philosophers and poets, if you remember, started looking at Islam as Islamic republicanism because Islam was the will of the people. I mean, what can we do with Karbala is endless. We don't know what kind of models and things we can come up. And that's why I said that whatever our traditions are and our heritage of fiqh and usul or in Western sciences, and I'm saying this as part of my PhD, that I gave the example of the fourth Imam's concept of rights to bodily organs. Maybe, God knows, maybe that concept will fail, I don't know. But maybe it's a possible concept to bring self-awareness to society, to bring iman to society, to change the way we look at human rights. So I feel we should never be content with what we are always given, always striving with the vision of al-Husayn and taking control of our identity and our lives. The second aspect of maybe increasing our faith and seeing what influences us is the way we look at akhlaq. As you know, the Quran actually contains more ethical verses than legal verses. Out of the 6,000 or so verses in the Quran, 6 of them only are to do with law or fiqh, and that's it. And most of the verses in the Quran are really to do with ethics, and that's why you'll find so many stories about the Prophet's struggles and how they were ethical to people, or Allah saying this is how you should behave, and all of these things. And the Quran, therefore, is fundamentally an ethical book. Imam Ali says in Nahj al-Balagha, although I'll do a lecture on this, he says that essentially the Quran is there to remove a few things from you. It's there to remove injustice from you. It's there to remove rebellion from you. It's there to remove hypocrisy from you, and it's there to remove misguidance from you. That's the role of the Quran. Forget the second we think that the Quran is there to be interpreted and how we look at the words and all of these things, because that's only one way of looking at the Quran. Should the Quran be a book that's got to be intellectually interpreted? Possibly. Maybe the Quran is fundamentally meant to be or meant to fulfill a spiritual role. The sermons in Nahj al-Balagha certainly point to the first point, that it has a fundamental spiritual kind of quality to it, and it's meant to elevate the nafs. And that's why the focus in the Quran is significantly towards akhlaq and spirituality. If you look at the Quran like that, the Quran becomes a kind of ethical teacher. So whenever we want to increase our iman, learning from the incidents of the prophets is a very beautiful thing. And that begs us this question, that whenever we perform obligations like salah or fasting, for example, we often say that if we miss our salah or fast, we have to give its qada, we have to give its compensation. And Ayatollah Amini, in the same book, Self-Building, makes a very beautiful point. He says that, have we ever thought that if I backbite against somebody, or if I don't fulfill a promise, or I tell a white lie, that I have to give a qada to that? That I have to go to that person and say, excuse me, I didn't fulfill the promise, or I said something bad about you, or I did this. Do we have the courage to do that? Because he says that if akhlaq constitutes the main body of the Quran as well as our hadith, and carries exactly, if not more, the same level of reward and punishment, then it means that whenever we behave badly, or we behave in a good way, we will attract the same level of reward or punishment, if not more, because that was the Prophet's mission, akhlaq, when we also pray salah, when we do salah and we fast. So looking at our akhlaqi obligations, our ethics, and saying, actually, this deserves a compensation from me. I actually now have to recompense this. Or that backbiting or promises or whatever have just as a higher standard as just as many shurut or conditions as salah has. This is also a way to look at akhlaq. And if we look at akhlaq like that, we can readily identify maybe where we are going wrong or right, or we can correct our wrongs immediately. And I think that's a very hard and difficult thing to do. It's very hard to say, I am wrong to somebody. It's very hard to say, I don't know something. That's a very hard, because you're now going against your own ego, and you're now trying to somehow put God in you, if you like, and say, actually now, what would God want me to do? To acknowledge one's limitations is the hardest thing, because essentially we are created with that sense of ego, and shedding the ego is the hardest thing. So again, removing the ego helps us increase our faith. And the last couple of things, I mentioned those 4 things. If you remember, maybe I'll deal with 1 or 2. How much? I've taken about 30 minutes. So maybe I'll deal with 1 or 2, and then I'll deal some tomorrow. One of the sources or one of the influences of ethics is fitrah. We are obviously created with fitrah, especially says in Surah Rum that we are inclined towards God and righteousness. But our fitrah always has to be evaluated. What is our inclination? Where is it going all the time? Is my inclination determined by my environment, my upbringing, what interpretation is given me of religion, what my forefathers did, as it says in the Quran, that when the prophets used to go to the people, the people used to say, but our forefathers did this. This is what we are inclined to. And one of the I shouldn't say shocking really, but one of the things which I read in sort of Aristotle's time in his books is that slavery was regarded as a very natural thing in society. I mean, even in our Prophet and Imam's time. And the eternal question is that when they were freeing slaves, did they want the institution of slavery to be absolutely abolished? Or was it just that slavery itself is still a meaningful thing, but you can still do it, but somehow still try to elevate the slave or compensate for the slave? And we're always asking these kind of questions. Maybe most of us would have a consensus, even fuqaha would have a kind of consensus that no, slavery is a wrong thing because it demeans our dignity. Now that's not really written anywhere or a great deal within our jurisprudence, but if slavery were to be activated, then would we still have to free a slave to compensate for a fast? That's a very big question to ask. But the reason I'm just giving you this discussion is what becomes natural to us. If you look at the way Aristotle wrote and other people in that time, slavery was very natural. So when we say we have fitrah and we say, oh, but we have fitrah and this is wonderful, but it requires constant self-evaluation. It requires always looking at what is determining this inclination in me. What is determining my spirituality all the time? If we can always ask us this question, then we can see even within ourselves, what sources are making decisions for us? Is it really our conscience? Is it something external to us that is making the decision? Is it the culture? Is it the custom? Then we can distinguish. No, I think this is me talking. That now I can say, right, I am building my faith in a very genuine way. And as I said, it goes back to Imam Ali's concept of yaqeen. We're always trying to determine and question what is around us. Salawat. So I think I'll continue the next 3 tomorrow and perhaps open it up for any Q&A. Any questions?
Assalamu alaikum. You mentioned Mutahari said he'd rather have one Abu Zar than having an Avicenna or a Ghazali. That particular statement, knowing when Mutahari probably said it during the pre-revolutionary times, and looking at the situation of the Muslims now, especially with Palestine on fire, and Gaza in particular, how does that statement sit with the current predicament of the Muslims today, where there is a big emphasis on education and hardly any on activism within our communities? I mean, none of us, well, not many of us turn up to demonstrations, not many of us turn up to vigils within this country. And isn't that all part of training that we're meant to learn from the message of Karbala?
Jazakallah for the question. Of course, the person that said it was Ali Shariati. And yes, I think in many respects I agree with you that perhaps we do need to focus more on sciences such as political philosophy or applied ethics and things like justice to build up models in our community to somehow give us the practical training and the practical know-how of how to act when there's a situation of injustice. And also, I think what you pointed to, which is perhaps what you're alluding to, is what is the role of a scholar? And is the role of a scholar only to sort of educate, or is the role of a scholar to be with the grassroots and on the front line? And we find in history that maybe only a few are like that, like Ayatollah Khomeini, maybe Ayatollah Bakr Sadr, Ali Shariati, because they managed to combine practical traits with those educational traits. And I'm not blaming scholars as such, because I think it's very difficult to combine that. You know, you speak to a researcher, academic, they're very happy reading and writing, and that is the kind of profession. And I think that's fine. But I think that we should never be content and say, this is the role of a scholar. No. We should not say, well, you only have to have a faqih or somebody that's a theologian or somebody that's a philosopher. No, you have to have a very rounded scholar. So in that, I agree with you. And second, as to why perhaps we don't do these things, I think, as I've said, that it's because we are living in a paradigm, which maybe Ali Shariati tried to break, which is that education or teaching in this way is the best thing and not focusing on other subjects. It took Ayatollah Khomeini to bring some political philosophy in Wilayat al-Faqih, in the guardianship of the jury consult, to say, look, this is what a Shia scholar could become, a kind of political stroke scholarly leader. Now we need 10 other models like that. That's the way. Yeah.
If I may, I was alluding actually not just to the scholar, but to us as people, as individuals, our responsibilities. Never mind the scholars for a minute. There's a responsibility to us as well, isn't there? We've got to get out there and do things as well. Are we just meant to sit back and let everybody else do everything? I mean, it seems to be there's more non-Muslims on these marches for Gaza than there are Muslims. I mean, they seem to have a better understanding of sacrifice than we do.
I would have to look at statistics and things. I mean, I'm in agreement with you in some respects, but when you have organizations like Islamic Human Rights Commission and a couple of others which I think as of late are popping up, I do see some awakening of the Muslim conscience, and which has been there as well. So I think that even if you look at our reaction to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, cartoons and documentary, I think we do have that awakening. I personally feel that it's not directed, and I think we maybe are picking and choosing certain projects and certain causes. I think that, and also the scariest thing for me is we don't know how to react. So when the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, documentary film which was a very disgusting film actually, obviously we were protesting as embassies and in other parts of the killing and all. I mean, why didn't we make a really great documentary? Why didn't we make a film and respond? Maybe we shouldn't have responded. Maybe we should have ignored it and the whole thing would have gone away. But it seems to me that we don't have guidelines of how to act. And that should come from scholarship, which I don't think it does. And second is that, yes, I think we together have to say, you know what, this is important to me. So few of us who are good at technology, we've got to come together and make it. So in that respect, I agree with you.
Any questions on the lady side?
Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned that you think that the Quran is predominantly an ethical text. Can I just ask how you differentiate between ethical verses and legalistic verses? Because arguably a legalistic verse is ethical to some extent, and any verse that talks about behavior is legalistic to some extent. So for me, the two seem to overlap, and I was just wondering how you differentiate between them, and could you just repeat the figure that you mentioned as well?
Yes, okay, Jazakallah.
Thank you.
The figure, I mean, the quote, the person who did the quote?
A figure as to how many verses are legalistic verses or
Oh, right, I said a sixth. I mean, some people say 500, 600 verses to do with fiqh only, out of over 6,236 or 6, yeah. No, I agree with you that law and ethics overlap, and in a way you can't have one without the other. Sometimes you have to command the akhlaq. I agree with you. I was just presenting a discussion of how we use the Quran, Perhaps in order to answer your question, I actually agree with it. But the main thing is that how do we use it? And Imam Ali Islam was saying that fundamentally it's this kind of practical, spiritual, ethical guide. And that gives us more of a connection to the Quran actually, which maybe depends on how often we read the Quran every day, I don't know. But if we already know that the Quran is like that, then it gives us a connection. And third, how you distinguish? Well, usually legal verses have an amr, a command as such. Qul, say, for example, or whatever it is. And therefore, you have this kind of idea that law comes with an injunction, which is usually obligatory or mustahab. That's how you usually differentiate. And second is sometimes within the content itself, that it is purely within the framework of, I don't know, a third to do with the inheritance or acting in a particular way, whatever it is. So then you have a very specific type of, it's like a statute or some legal condition. That's usually, but an ethics can be very broad. It can be just simply a reflective kind of verse and these things. But usually that's how it's distinguished. There's some kind of legal condition in there, which also a hadith reflects or a hadith clarifies. So if you have a hadith of the 6th Imam alayhi salam related to inheritance, it kind of reflects the verse.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to ask you, in the Quran we read that prayer helps you to prevent wickedness and evil. Then the question arises in my mind often is, how come then the people who killed Imam Hussein and his family, they prayed, they responded to azan and all that, but they still committed the act of wickedness. So how do you explain that?
Yes, Jazakallah. Essentially, this is explained throughout Nahjul Balagha in many of the sermons of Imam Ali alayhi salam actually, where essentially he's telling people like the Khawarij, okay, like the Ibn Muljim, for example, who killed Imam Ali, or the people in Karbala, where essentially they did not focus on their own desires and how they imposed those desires on religion. So they would segregate salah, for example, and say that is a legal action for me to fulfill, maybe to get reward or fulfill an injunction. Whereas, as Imam Ali said in the hadith which I read out, that the morals in themselves guarantee the sense of prosperity and victory. And in their minds, they did not seem to understand that behind the salah, what should motivate the salah is exactly the morality and the spiritual ethics of it. So as I said, that shukranillah, one of the key aspects of faith, is when you go into sajda, that is the example of humility. And they did not seem to make that connection in their wider life. So to me at least, and going through sources, they did not focus on the internal layer of religion and the Quran. And second, and in Sermon 176, Imam Ali does specifically say that the people, and Imam Hussein says the same thing during his journey of Karbala, he says to the Kufans, if I remember correctly, he says that you people decided to take some parts of the Quran and reject others. You people decided to act on your desires. So it was a segregated way of looking at religion. That's the explicit answer. And in a way that's still relevant to us, of course. Whether we pray salah and then what we do after that is another question. So again, having a very, as I said in the lecture, a complete view of faith is a way to rectify this problem.
Any more questions?
No? Okay. Brothers and sisters, we have moved on in our journey in Karbala, and we have lost many people, many martyrs. We have lost Khur. And now we are going to lose Habib ibn Madahir. After Muslim ibn Aqil was martyred, Hussein alayhi salam was looking for support, was looking for somebody to rely on. And it was our dear Habib who became one of the standard bearers or flag bearers of al-Husayn alayhi salam. And one of the beautiful things that he said before he went into battle, he said, "O Hussein, I cannot let you go into battle. I will go into battle first. I, an old man, will go into battle first. And not only that, before I go into battle, I want to make sure that I offer my prayers with you. I want to be able to respect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I want to fulfill my oath to Him. This was Habib, a demonstration of complete faith. As Habib was advancing to the army, Umar ibn Sa'ad cried out, "O Husayn, pray as many prayers as you want. They will not be accepted." Habib replied, "O most wretched of creatures, will your prayers be accepted if the prayers of the son of the messenger are not? How can you say this?" Husayn ibn Numair, the person who retorted, was so angry that he started to then advance to Habib. According to reports, Habib killed many or showed his bravery. And when Habib was about to be martyred, he said, "O Master, I swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I want to convey salutations to your grandfather, the Messenger of Allah, to your father Ali, and to your brother al-Husayn." And he said, "I swear, had we been equal to you in number or half of you, you would have turned your backs to us in flight. O most wicked of creatures in lineage and in deeds, you have behaved oppressively to the family of the Prophet." When Habib was struck and Habib could not stand, Husayn welcomed him in his arms. Husayn started crying, for now he was going to lose another support, for he had already lost Muslim ibn Aqil. The Imam went to Habib's torn body. He rested Habib's head in his lap. He started crying and he said, "How excellent a man you were, O Habib! Indeed, you recite the whole of the Quran in a single night." Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. May Allah help us increase our faith. Surah Al-Fatiha.